We're looking here at the lowlands of the Hawaiian island of Kauai. This lowland area is a wetland community, and it supports quite a variety of plants and animals. And then in the background we see the highlands, the mountains of the island, in which an even more diverse community of organisms inhabits the forests. Note also that the sun is streaming through these clouds here, and as we've talked about previously, this is the ultimate source of energy that makes all these ecosystems go. So we have yet to say more about this topic of energy in ecosystems and trophic levels. And so let's begin this discussion by talking about an extension of this trophic level idea, the idea of food webs. Now, this idea of trophic levels, this idea of a chain linking major groupings of organisms, is really just the simplest way of looking at how organisms within ecosystems are related. Take, for example, this species here, catbird. This bird we might think of as a secondary consumer in that it eats insects, but we can also think of it as being a primary consumer in that it eats fruit. Fruit, in fact, is an important part of its diet, especially at certain times of the year. So, as I was discussing in our last program, organisms like this are referred to as omnivores. And so their relationship with the trophic levels is more complex. There isn't a simple relationship with trophic levels for many species, in fact. And so this brings up the notion of the food web, this network of relationships between organisms that live within a community. Let's take a look at another example. This is a rose-breasted grosbeak, which is a finch-like kind of a creature. Notice it's got a big, thick beak, very different from that beak of the catbird. It is a common and widespread forest species in eastern North America. Now, again, its relationships with other organisms are more complex than simply interacting with one other trophic level. It uses that big, thick beak to eat things like seeds, but it also uses that beak to eat insects. So this is a common phenomenon among many kinds of animals, not just birds, but many kinds of animals, is that they are involved interacting with a whole variety of other kinds of organisms, different species of plants, different species of animals. So let's see what this might look like if we made a graphical representation of the relationship among organisms. This is a diagram prepared by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that illustrates a food web, a reasonably simple food web that we might find in the Arctic. So we have photosynthetic organisms, primary producers, single-celled algae, which are referred to as phytoplankton, which come in a variety of different species and forms, and these are eaten by other kinds of organisms. For example, there are these tiny arthropod relatives that also float in the upper water column, generally referred to as zooplankton And these tiny little creatures are in turn eaten by bigger creatures, which might then be eaten by fish. And fish in turn might get eaten by a sea lion or a seal. And ultimately, the very top predator of this system would be the polar bear. Notice also that as organisms in the upper part of the ocean die, their remains sink to the sea floor and are then fed upon by detritivores like lobsters. So within this relatively simple web of organisms, you have individuals that do a variety of different kinds of things. So we can summarize these ideas like this. The idea that there are many connections between species, both within and between trophic levels. And still another example in this photograph here, rather like some of those we spoke of before, you have a little bird here that can do a bunch of different things. It can consume materials from primary consumers, but it can also eat insects. Now within these food webs, as energy is passed from one trophic level to the next, a lot of that energy gets dissipated. All of the energy that is captured by consumers is not passed to primary consumers, for example. Much of that energy is used up in metabolic activities. A lot of it is lost as thermal energy, heat. So every minute that you're alive, for example, your body is manufacturing thermal energy, and that thermal energy is continually dissipated into the surrounding environment. And so we can speak of trophic efficiency. If we look at the amount of solar energy that comes into the earth, only about 1% of that actually gets used by living organisms to begin with. And then a good deal of the energy that's captured by photosynthetic organisms is used up in metabolic activities. Estimates are 30 to 75%, depending upon the kind of community and part of the world. Tropical communities can be particularly inefficient at storing energy. Once, however, that energy from primary producers is passed along to consumers, pretty much at every trophic level, only about 10% of the energy that is present at one level is present at the next. However, that's only an initial accounting. If we also take into account the activity of decomposers on these food webs, then we can account for a lot more of the energy. It all doesn't simply disappear as heat. Some of it is incorporated into the decomposer portion of the food web. Let's take a look at primary productivity figures for a variety of ecosystems around the world. If we look at deserts, for example, their primary productivity is quite low. If we also included open ocean in this graphic here, it would also be similarly quite low. We might think of deep ocean parts of the world as being kind of like aquatic deserts in their lack of productivity. On the other hand, if we look at some temperate systems, like temperate seasonal forest, you see an order of magnitude greater productivity in those systems. Although when you compare temperate forests to tropical forests, there's again a huge jump. Tropical forests with a 12-month growing season, rapid nutrient cycling, have very high primary productivity. In fact, tropical rainforest systems are generally thought to be the most productive systems on Earth. Although, when we look at temperate zone wetland systems, some of them can actually rival tropical rainforests in terms of productivity. So freshwater marshes, and to a lesser extent, saltwater marsh systems are rather productive. All these kinds of high productivity, naturally occurring ecosystems, in fact, far outstrip typical temperate croplands in terms of productivity. So from that table, we can make some generalizations. Wet tropical parts of the world, such as tropical rainforests, are among the most productive ecosystems on Earth. Coral reefs, in terms of marine systems, are also highly productive. These are also tropical systems. These systems benefit from the 12-month growing season. There's never a cold time. They rapidly recycle nutrients during that continual growing season. And they also benefit from the high degree of incident solar radiation they receive, the sun being high overhead all year long. Especially temperate freshwater marshes can rival these tropical areas, however, and the reasons are several. First of all, you have abundant moisture in marshes. Moisture, of course, is one of the things that makes plants grow. You also tend to have a rich nutrient supply. And you also have movement of water through these systems, which is one of the agents of bringing nutrients to them. It's also been suggested that this flow of water, stream water, sheet flow water through marshes also carries away waste products, thereby facilitating the high productivity that's found in them. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have deserts and the deep oceans, open ocean, away from continental shelves as being very low productivity environments, where in the case of deserts you have inadequate rainfall, not necessarily inadequate nutrients. People often make that assumption that desert soils are nutrient poor, and that's not necessarily the case at all. In the case of oceans, there's plenty of moisture, but in that instance, nutrients are a limiting factor. And without those nutrients, the oceans cannot be productive. So with that, we've pretty much covered what I want to cover concerning the topic of bioenergetics, energy flow through ecosystems, and how that energy makes its way through trophic levels in food webs. And now let's turn our attention to another topic, that of diversity. By diversity, I mean how many kinds of organisms do you find within a community, and what kinds of populations do these organisms have within these communities? The term diversity is a bit more complex than most people realize, and so we're going to have to clarify this term. We're looking here at a rather ancient landscape. This is the Pine Barrens of southern New Jersey, which is the first really extensive region of coastal plain that we find in eastern North America. It is south of the area that was glaciated during Ice Age times. And so it's a very interesting place to explore. There are a number of endemic species here, that is, species that only occur in this environment. And there are several other species that occur primarily here and then only in a few other spots. There's a very distinctive tiny little fern called the curlygrass fern that lives right in this area here. In fact, in a little wetland right near the car, you can find that. And there's a frog that lives in that wetland, the Pine Barrens tree frog. And we could mention other species as well that are characteristic of this landscape. However, if we look at the community as a whole, if you start looking at the forest trees there, there's pretty much one kind of tree present, the pitch pine. So the forest canopy has a low diversity, and much of that has to do with the particular kinds of ecological conditions we find in this environment. It's a very fire-prone environment, and fire tends to select out deciduous species of trees like oaks and things like that that otherwise would invade this environment and suppress the pitch pines. But in the presence of fire, you have this low diversity forest canopy of almost exclusively just this one species of tree. And notice that it's rather open and park-like. Also as a consequence of the importance of fire in this system. Now the understory that comes up under these trees is rather more diverse. I still wouldn't call it extremely diverse. There are a number of blueberry relatives that live in this kind of an environment. We can find huckleberries and several kinds of upland blueberries. And in the adjacent wetlands, that these streams that run through this Pine Barrens area, there's still other species of blueberry relatives, including the commercially important highbush blueberry, which is also farmed extensively in this part of the state. There's quite a few blueberry plantations. And in addition to woody plants, there are a certain number of herbaceous plants that occur here. There's some blue stem grass that I can see here, and we could find a number of other herbaceous kinds of species here as well. But still, all in all, I would describe this community as comparatively low diversity as forest systems go. You have communities that are dominated by relatively few species in very high numbers. Each species has, or many of the species I should say, have very large populations. But on the other hand, there's not that many species. That is what we would refer to as a relatively low diversity system. Let's compare it to this system here. We're looking here at Southeast Asian tropical rainforest, where you have a huge variety of species of plants as well as animals. The number of bird species that live in these forests is just remarkable. For example, if we look at the trees here, instead of there being one dominant species, there are really no dominant species. There are a lot of species that are present in comparatively low numbers. You have a whole variety of broadleaf species, and then you have a variety of things like different species of palms. You have species of tree cycad. You have species of tree fern. So quite a mix of kinds of tree species. And if you look in the understory, there's also quite a number of different kinds of things, bizarre kinds of things. Those funny looking leaves in the foreground are from pandanus trees, which look like nothing that I've seen in the New World. And then if you look at the branches of the trees, there are all sorts of things growing on the branches of the trees in this picture. There's various kinds of ferns that live not only on the forest floor, but also on the trunks of the trees. There are various species of orchids that colonize the trunks, branches of the trees. There are more mosses and lichens and just a whole host of different kinds of things that occur in this environment. So in this situation, instead of having a few dominant species present very abundantly, you have a large number of species, none of which dominate the community. This is what we would refer to as a high diversity environment. What I'm getting at here is that there are components to diversity. The term diversity refers to not just the number of species, but also how many individuals per species there are. The components of species diversity are referred to as species richness, which is what people usually use as a synonym for diversity, and it's not. Species richness refers simply to how many species of organisms, how many different kinds of organisms are present within a community. The concept of how many individuals per species is referred to as species evenness. So when you have a relatively small number of individuals in a lot of species, that's referred to as having individuals evenly distributed among the species, high species evenness. And that's what you see in many kinds of tropical rainforest or areas around the world. And again, you can see in this photograph here that same kind of profusion of life in the picture, with many kinds of things growing out of other things. And we can contrast that to that Pine Barrens community where you have comparatively low diversity, not nearly as many species, and also the species that are present, you have a few species that are represented by many, many individuals. So those environments have low species evenness. The study of diversity has been of great interest to ecologists. It's been studied in many different ways for quite a long time now. Really, the better part of 100 years. People have been very curious about what kinds of things lead to causing diversity and what kinds of patterns of diversity we can see across planet Earth, and a whole variety of similar kinds of questions that relate to this topic. Let's consider for a few minutes the kinds of phenomena that lead to patterns of diversity that one might find across a large landscape. We're looking here at illustrations of eastern Connecticut, which is an area that I've worked in for years and years and years. And over those years, I've been very interested in the forest bird community of eastern Connecticut. Eastern Connecticut, as it turns out, is still very heavily forested. Something on the order of 2/3 to 3/4 of the landscape is still extensively forested. So it's got well-developed forest bird communities, and it's interesting to take a look at where the species are in relationship to a variety of environmental parameters. And so that's exactly what I've done. I've taken a look at species richness as well as population densities across that landscape. And what you see is that, especially in wintertime, if you look at the right-hand map, that shows a map from my data of where species richness is concentrated across this region. And what you see is that in the wintertime, the darkest areas refer to areas of the greatest richness. And they are concentrated along the coast. And the left-hand side of that image is the Connecticut River Valley, major river through New England. And the center of that image is the Thames River Valley. Not as big of a river regionally, but locally it's a very large river with a considerable valley around it. And so that's where you find the greatest species richness. And then as we travel north, richness drops off, and richness tends to be lowest right at the top of the image, which is also the region that's most mountainous, coldest in the winter. If we compare that to the map on the left, a map of elevations of this region, we can see that there's quite a remarkable relationship there. The lowlands along the coast and in the Thames Valley and in the Connecticut River Valley, those lowland areas in winter support the greatest species richness. And the areas at the very top of the image, most mountainous, coldest in winter, most snow and all that sort of thing, those kinds of areas support the fewest species. Now this mimics to a substantial degree patterns that we see not just across a landscape like southern New England, but even globally we see a pattern that's something like that. You tend to find, as you go from north to south, an increase in species richness. The number of species do tend to grow as you go from Arctic to tropics, in other words. And so this is observing the same kind of a pattern at a smaller scale, what's often referred to as the landscape scale. Now, just to prove that I really did go out and make all those measurements to produce those graphics, here I am out doing it at a place in that northern Connecticut area characterized by very few bird species. And on this particular day, it was unusually cold, even for New England. It was just bitter. It was down around 10 below 0 Fahrenheit. And I can assure you that on that day, there were darn few birds to be found in this part of the state. Now, we still actually have a fair amount to discuss under the heading of diversity. We've talked about one aspect of diversity that people find interesting to study, but there's many other things to discuss yet. And so in our next program, we will continue on with this topic. But with me standing out in that foot of snow, or 2 feet of snow, I think it was actually, I think that's where we will close for today.